Chapter 1. The Calabrian Inn. Lazy dog. Can't he drive faster, keeping us grilling here in the heat? I should like to have the use of his whip for a few minutes and try its effect upon his shoulders. Such was the impatient exclamation of Horace Cleveland, as for the third time he thrust his head out of the carriage window. "I wish that we had never come to Calabria at all," sighed his mother. Horace was resuming his lounging position in the carriage after hurling a few Italian words of abuse at the driver, as she added, "It was a nonsensical whim of yours, Horace, to bring us into this wild land, when we might have remained in comfort at Naples, with every convenience around us, such as my weak health so much requires." "Convenience," repeated Horace contemptuously. "Would you compare the luxuries of Naples, its drives, its bouquets, its ices, its idle amusements, with the glorious scenery of a land like this? Look what a splendid mountain rises there, all clothed to the very summit with myrtle, aloes, and cactus, where here and there stands a tall palm, like the king of the forest, overlooking the rest. And see what an expanse, what an ocean of olives stretches yonder. I do not admire the olive, with its rugged stem and dull dingy leaves," observed Mrs. Cleveland. "Not when the breeze ruffles those leaves and shows their silver linings. Look there now, how beautiful they appear under the brightness of an Italian sky." "I am too weary to admire anything," said Mrs. Cleveland with a yawn, "and it seems as if we were never to reach the inn at Subtitle. The heat is almost suffocating." "I say," helloed Horace to the driver, "how long shall we be in arriving at Subtitle?" The Italian shrugged his shoulders, and without taking the trouble to turn round made reply, "We shall not be there till 24 o'clock, signore." 24 o'clock, exclaimed Horace, not surprised, however, by the expression, as the reader may possibly be, as he was familiar with the Italian mode of reckoning the 24 hours from sunset to sunset. "Is there no inn, no locanda, where we could rest on the way?" "Si, signore," answered the Calabrese, pointing onwards with his whip to a small, irregularly built house, which seemed wedged between two masses of rock overgrown with cactus, and which was so much of the color of the cliffs that one might fancy that it had grown out of them. "It looks much more picturesque than comfortable," observed Horace, drawing back his head and showing the inn to his mother. "Let's stop there, or anywhere," gasped Mrs. Cleveland, fanning herself with the air of one whose patience as well as strength is almost exhausted. "I can go no further today." "We can stop and bait," said Horace, and again he leaned out of the window to give his orders to the driver in the haughty tone of command which he seemed to think befitting an English milordo. It was clear at a glance that Horace Cleveland regarded himself as one of the lords of creation, and, from national or family or personal pride, considered himself superior to all such of his fellow creatures as he might meet in Calabria. His manner, even to his mother, was petulant and imperious. Horace Cleveland had, indeed, much to foster his vanity and strengthen his pride. Horace occupied a proud position in his school, and he plumed himself not a little upon it. "The boy is father of the man," sang the poet, and on the strength of that aphorism, Horace built up a high tower of airy hopes. He had been accustomed to be admired, imitated, followed, in the little world of a public school, and he expected to hold the same place in the great world, which he soon must enter. Horace felt himself born to command. The youth's triumphs at school had hardly tended to make him more agreeable at home. He was an only child, and his widowed mother regarded him as her all in all. Very proud was Mrs. Cleveland of his talents, very proud of his success. With fond admiration, she gazed on his open, handsome countenance, the high forehead, the clear gray eye, and thought that amongst all his companions none could compare with her son. And yet Mrs. Cleveland was by no means altogether contented with Horace. She would have been better pleased had he exhibited less spirit and more submission. Horace was eager to claim a man's independence. Mrs. Cleveland clung to a parent's authority. It is probable that the lady would have retained more influence over her boy had she exercised it more judiciously. She had been as an unskillful rider, who, instead of keeping a light but firm hand on the bridle, alternately threw down the rein and caught it up to jerk the mouth of his restive steed and irritate its temper. Delicate health and weak nerves had combined to make the widowed lady sometimes peevish and even unreasonable, and her will often clashed with that of her son to a degree that caused a painful jar upon the feelings of both. Thus those who were dearer to each other than all the world besides were each not unfrequently a source of annoyance and irritability even to the being best beloved. I am sure that it was great folly to come to Calabria at all, exclaimed Mrs. Cleveland, as the chaise drew up at the door of the inn. Now this was what Horace could not endure to hear, since it had been to gratify his wishes, and quite against her own judgment, that his mother had quitted Naples for the mountainous south of Italy. Moreover, Horace had heard that same exclamation nearly 10 times already on that day, and the effect of heat and weariness had drawn largely on his stock of patience. Ready to vent his ill humor on the first thing that he touched, Horace flung open the door of the chaise as he might have hit at a foe, and rudely pushed aside a young Italian who had come forward to help the lady to alight. The hot blood rose to the stranger's sunburnt cheek, and a look of anger, instantly repressed, passed like lightning over his face. Mrs. Cleveland caught the look, transient as it was, and as she walked into the inn, laid her hand on the arm of her son, and whispered to him in English, "For mercy's sake, do not treat these people with rudeness. You know that all these Italians carry stilettos in their vests. We are alone, amongst strangers." Horace's only reply was a look to express contempt for all Italians in general, and this one in particular, and a disregard for all considerations founded upon personal fear. He snatched up a grip, and 1 or 2 shawls from the chaise, and carried them into the locanda, being too much out of humor to offer his mother the support of his arm. Mrs. Cleveland was shown into the little inn by its master, who came forth to meet her. He was a stout, red-faced man with one eye, and a countenance by no means prepossessing. "Giuseppina, Giuseppina," he shouted. A Calabrese girl, barefooted, attired in a bright blue dress with an orange border, and wearing large gold earrings and chain, came to answer the call. Guided by her, the weary lady entered a small, close room which might be termed the parlor, but which was evidently put to many more uses. The entrance of the visitors disturbed a hen and a whole brood of sickly chickens, which cackling and fluttering made a hasty retreat across the threshold. On one part of the dirty earthen floor was piled a set of empty wineskins, the odor from which blended with the more disagreeable scent from some thousands of silkworm cocoons heaped together in a corner. "Have you no better quarters to give us than this hole?" cried Horace to Giuseppina in the Italian language, which he spoke with ease. "No, signore," replied the girl, as she swept from the table a confused litter of old sacking, chaff, and oakum, in order to make preparation for the coming meal, which Horace, with a look of disgust, forthwith proceeded to order. Mrs. Cleveland, being less familiar with the language, usually left such arrangements to her son. "What can you give us?" asked Horace. "A bean, signore, macaroni," replied the barefooted maiden. "Macaroni, of course, and what besides?" Giuseppina glanced to the right at the wineskins, then to the left at the heap of cocoons, as if to gather from them some culinary idea, shrugged her shoulders and suggested omelette, but in a tone expressive of doubt. "Omelette, then, and anything else that you may have, and be quick, for the lady is weary and wants refreshment," cried Horace. Giuseppina showed her white teeth in a smile, and quitted the parlor. "One is stifled in this horrible den," exclaimed Horace, stalking up to the window and throwing it open. Very little air was admitted on that sultry afternoon, but there came the sound of voices from without. "What are the people doing outside, Horace?" faintly inquired Mrs. Cleveland. "Like Italians, doing nothing," was the reply. "They are merely gathering round that young man whom we saw at the door, apparently to listen to his singing, for he has a guitar in his hand." "That Italian whom you struck?" inquired Mrs. Cleveland. "I did not strike him. I only pushed him back. These fellows must be taught to know their own place," Horace haughtily replied. "My dear boy," said Mrs. Cleveland, leaning forward on the chair on which she had wearily sunk, "you must acquire, indeed you must, a more gentle and conciliatory manner. In a wild, strange place like this, altogether out of the bounds of civilization, a thoughtless act might bring serious trouble. A wanton insult might cost a life." Horace did not answer, and as he remained looking out the window, his mother could not see on his face the effect of her gentle reproof. She saw, however, that he was impatiently moving his foot up and down, which was his trick when he had to listen to anything which it did not please him to hear. A few chords on a guitar, touched by a skillful hand, were now heard, and immediately the hum of voices without was silenced. "I hate to see a man play a guitar," exclaimed Horace. As he spoke, the tones of a voice singularly melodious and rich mingled with those of the instrument, and Mrs. Cleveland, weary as she felt, was lured to the window to listen. Surrounded by a group of Calabrese stood the musician. He was simply but picturesquely attired, after the fashion of his country, the red jacket not worn, but carried across the shoulder ready to be put on in season of rain, left exposed to view the white shirt. A felt hat of a somewhat oval shape shaded a countenance which, with its classical outlines and thoughtful expression, could have formed a study for an artist. The song of the young Italian, translated into English, might run thus. If to pine in a dungeon were e'er my fate, when light struggled in through the iron grate, what view would most soothe my unwearied eye? The boundless ocean, the earth, or sky? Oh, not the ocean, its ceaseless swell, with my restless grief would accord too well. The voice of its wild waves would break my sleep, and the captive bend o'er his chain and weep. 'Twere sweet to gaze on the laughing earth, and view, though distant, its scenes of mirth. Ah, no, they would but recall life's flowers to one who had lost them all. The sky, unbounded, bright, with its silvery moon and its stars of light, the blush of morning, the evening glow, its passing clouds, and its radiant bow. There would I fix my unwearied eye, till fancy could paint a bright world on high, and earth and its sorrows would fade in night, with freedom before me, and heaven in sight. Chapter 2. A suspicious character. Who is that singer? Inquired Mrs. Cleveland in broken Italian of the girl Giuseppina, who had just re-entered the room with a large dish of macaroni which looked like a pile of tobacco pipes. Improvisatore, answered the girl. What is that? Inquired Horace. An improvisatore, replied Mrs. Cleveland, is one who makes poetry on the spur of the moment. This class of minstrels is, I believe, peculiar to Italy, the beautiful language of the country giving facility to rapid composition. Do you suppose, she continued, addressing herself to Giuseppina, that the young man really made that song about prisons himself? Prisons, repeated the Calabrese, with a slight but expressive shrug of the shoulders. I should say that Raphael might very well sing about prisons. You don't mean us to understand, said Horace, that, young as he seems, he has been acquainted with the inside of them? Chissà, who knows? Replied the girl, with another expressive shrug, as she placed his dish upon the table. He was never imprisoned, I trust, for any crime? Inquired Mrs. Cleveland, more uneasy than ever at the recollection of Horace's rudeness to the stranger. Chiesa, repeated the girl. I cannot believe, said the lady, that there can lurk much harm in one with such a countenance and such an exquisite voice. Oh, he's an Italian, cried Horace, who rather prided himself on his prejudices. Giuseppina lingered, fidgeting about the table, moving the dish now to the right, now to the left, as if she could never satisfy herself that she had placed it perfectly straight. Does this Raphael, as you call him, said Horace, earn his living by his music? Chiesa, repeated Giuseppina, not looking up, but showing her teeth in a meaning smile. Does the idle fellow do nothing but sing and play? He cures the sick also, replied Giuseppina. He gathers herbs and has wonderful power to take away fever and to heal wounds from sword or from shot. But, she added, crossing herself and shaking her head, "The abbot, says that none can tell how he came by his knowledge." This Raphael is looked upon, then, as rather a suspicious character? Giuseppina dropped her voice and looked as if the desire to impart information were struggling with a fear of danger from so doing as she made answer. "He is certainly no stranger to Matteo." The last word was pronounced in a whisper so low that both Mrs. Cleveland and her son had to bend forward to catch the name. "Who is Matteo?" asked Horace. Giuseppina raised her hands and eyebrows with a gesture of surprise. "Not know Matteo. All the world knows Matteo," she said with low but rapid utterance, glancing around her as she did so, as if to make sure that no third listener was present. "We don't speak of him. No one speaks of him, but," said Horace with some curiosity as the speaker came to a pause. "Oh," continued Giuseppina, with the same stealthy look and quick utterance. "Did not the signori hear how the government courier was stopped and robbed of $300 on the high road, and the Cavaliero Donato waylaid and shot dead? It is said that they owed him a grudge. And the Contessa Albany was attacked in her dettorino and all her jewels taken, and her servants knocked on the head." "By whom? By this Matteo?" asked Horace, while his mother, who only understood half of the girl's information, clasped her hands with a gesture of alarm. "Zitto!" "Hush!" whispered the talkative Calabrese, who appeared, however, greatly to relish the diversion of frightening an English lady. Horace looked as if he could not be frightened. "And does your government do nothing to keep down such banditti?" said young Cleveland. "What are the soldiers about?" "I soldati." "Ah," replied Giuseppina with an expressive nod. "There was a party of them here today, horsemen, on their way to Reggio. They had a prisoner with them, arms bound behind his back." The girl put back her own elbows and scowled darkly, as if acting the part of a captured bandit. "I hope that it was this Matteo," cried Horace. "Zitto!" "Hush!" again whispered the girl. "It was not Matteo. They said it was his son." "I suppose that the soldiers were taking him to Reggio for trial." Giuseppina again nodded her head. "And what is likely to become of him?" The girl twisted her finger in the chain which she wore, tightening it round her neck, but only answered with a shrug, "Chi sa," and quitted the room to bring in the rest of the dinner. "Horace, what a dreadful place we have come to," gasped Mrs. Cleveland. The youth laughed as he seated himself at the table. "It is clear that one has some chance of an adventure in Calabria," said he. "Keep me from adventures," exclaimed the lady. "Did not the girl tell us?" I could hardly understand her, for she spoke so fast, of people being robbed and murdered on the high road by banditti. "Ah, but the soldiers are wide awake," suggested Horace, helping the macaroni. "I hope that he was not now speaking of the military, will bring us something better worth eating than this." Giuseppina pushed the door open with her knee and re-entered, a dish of omelette in one hand, a second full of snow in the other, and a bottle of wine under her arm. "Where will the soldiers be tonight?" asked Mrs. Cleveland with some anxiety. "I wish that we had asked for an escort." "They'll be at Subtitle, no doubt," answered Giuseppina, setting down the viands which she had brought. "We'll be at Subtitle tonight also," said Horace, adding in English, "So, mother, you need fear nothing." "Subtitle tonight." "No. It would be dark ere the signore could arrive there," observed Giuseppina. "The signore can have good beds here." "Here," exclaimed Horace, looking around him in disgust. "The place is not fit for a hound." "But, my dear child," said Mrs. Cleveland, "safety is to be thought of even before comfort." Horace replied to his mother, like herself speaking in English, which Giuseppina, unnecessarily loitering by the table, tried to understand with her eyes, as it conveyed no meaning to her ears. "You talk of safety as if this place were safe. Have you not just heard that one of the gang of banditti is below, a fellow let loose from a prison?" "The improvisatore," said Mrs. Cleveland. "I did not understand that he was actually one of the band." "But I did," pursued Horace, in his overbearing manner, "and I saw the master of this very house, who, by the way, looks a ruffian if ever there was one, in close conference with this very Raphael, who has doubtless come here for no good." Mrs. Cleveland pushed away the plate of untasted food before her, nervous anxiety, having taken from the weary lady all inclination to eat. Horace, to whom a little danger was rather a pleasant excitement, had already half demolished the omelette. "The signora is not well. The signora must not travel further today," suggested Giuseppina. Horace glanced up hastily at his mother, but seeing on her anxious countenance nothing to excite his fears for her health, he impatiently motioned to the girl to quit the room, as he felt more at his ease when her black eyes were not watching his lips. Giuseppina, with lingering step, withdrew. "I wish that you would eat, mother. You know that you will be quite exhausted if you don't," cried Horace in a tone of vexation. "I can't travel in the dark. I can't go to be waylaid, robbed, perhaps." "Don't you see," cried Horace, striking the handle of his spoon on the table to give more force to his argument, "that if we stay here we are just as likely to come to grief? Have you never heard or read of horrid little wayside inns kept by robbers in disguise, of beds contrived to fall down upon travelers and crush them, of stealthy footsteps at night, and all that sort of thing? Now this seems to be exactly the place for such an unpleasant adventure." "Oh, why did we ever come to Calabria?" exclaimed Mrs. Cleveland, sinking back in her chair. Horace felt some self-reproach for thus adding to the terrors of his mother. He hastily finished his omelette and said in a more reassuring voice, "You see, mother dear, if we once get to Subtitle, we'll be under the wing of the law. You can travel with a military escort like a queen. But it is the journey to Subtitle. Never fear that. It will soon be over. Anything is better than stopping here." Horace presently pushed back his chair and, rising from the table, said to Mrs. Cleveland, "I'm going to order Giacomo to put to the horses. The sooner we're off, the better." And without waiting to hear his mother's objections, the youth hastily left the apartment. "Willful, unmanageable boy," murmured the lady to herself. "He thinks that he knows better than everyone else, and I feel too much exhausted and worn out to oppose him." The charge of such an ungovernable child is too much for a poor widow like me. I should never have yielded to his entreaties and come to this horrible, desolate place. If I once find myself again in a civilized land, once again know the comforts of a home, nothing on earth shall persuade me to go a second time upon a wild expedition such as this. Chapter 3. Bitter Words. Horace found Giacomo the driver seated outside the door of the inn, enjoying al fresco, in the open air, a large plateful of macaroni. As Horace came towards him, the man looked a thoroughly characteristic specimen of his nation, half supporting himself on his elbow, while his head was thrown back to enable him with more convenience to drop into his mouth some 6 inches length of the white moist tube, to which he was helping himself with his fingers. Giacomo, put in the horses at once. We must make good speed to reach Subtitle tonight, said Horace. The Italian stared at the speaker with a look of surprise and dissatisfaction. The senior forgets that the day is advanced, the way mountainous, the horses tired, the signora faint, and the roads not safe after dark, said the man. It would be no wise act to start before morning. That is for me to decide, and not for you, said the young Englishman with hauteur. You can have excellent accommodation here, good beds, good fare. What more can the signore require? Said the one-eyed host, pointing towards the inn with a peculiar and stealthy expression in his disagreeable face, which confirmed Horace in his resolution to depart. Giacomo harnessed the horses, and directly he exclaimed, "If there be any delay, not an extra carlino, a small coin, shall you have at the end of the journey." The driver, with an exclamation directed to his patron saint and some mutterings which Horace did not understand, began making preparations to obey, moving his lazy limbs more leisurely than suited the impatience of his employer. The host, shrugging his shoulders, went into the inn. As Horace was about to follow him thither, the improvisatore, who had been standing under the shadow of a neighboring tree unperceived by the youth, came forward and crossed over between him and the door, not looking at Horace, nor appearing to observe him, but as he passed close in front of him, dropping the words, "Do not go," in a low but earnest tone. Horace glanced in surprise after the speaker, startled by so strange a warning from the last person whom he should have expected to give one. He would have liked to have questioned Raphael, but the improvisatore had already disappeared. "I wonder if it be wise to start," thought Horace, whose resolution for the first time began to waver. "Yet I have no reason to trust this stranger, who seems to bear an evil character, even amongst the people of this place." "The senior has changed his mind?" inquired Giacomo with a grin, the man having probably detected a look of indecision upon the face of young Cleveland. This way of putting the question fixed the determination of Horace, who secretly prided himself upon what he thought strength and decision of character. "I never change my mind," he said haughtily. "I shall be ready to start in 10 minutes. Let me then find the carriage at the door, or you shall have reason to repent of the delay." In about a quarter of an hour the vehicle stood ready in front of the inn. The one-eyed man, who seemed to combine in himself the offices of landlord and ostler, was there to see his guests depart. Giuseppina was at the door, and about half a dozen barefooted brown urchins crowded together like bees to view the strangers enter the carriage, as they had stared a few hours before at the soldiers bearing the bandit away. Raphael stood with folded arms near the heads of the horses. He exchanged words with no one, nor seemed to take notice of the whispered remarks of the children who glanced at him ever and anon. "The soldiers had him once," said one boy, pointing to the improvisatory. "Did they tie his arms behind him? I wonder whether he has the marks on his wrists. How did he get away? Did Matteo break his prison and set him free? Perhaps the soldiers let him off because he sings so fine," suggested one black-eyed little damsel, with uncombed hair falling in dark masses on each side of her merry brown face. "I like Raphael. He cured my bad leg, and he speaks so kind," said another. "But he's a bad man, I know he's a bad man," whispered a thin, sallow child with a solemn look. "He does not bow to the Madonna, nor touch the holy water." "He does," exclaimed the former speaker, indignant at so dark an imputation being thrown on his benefactor. "But he does not," persisted the sallow child. "I've watched him again and again. He never bows to the holy image, nor crosses himself, and I don't believe that he tells his beads, or ever goes to confess. Mother says that he's a wicked man, and prays to none of the saints." The faintest approach to a smile on the lips of the young Italian alone betrayed that he heard any part of the conversation of which he was the subject. The attention of the children was now diverted to the travelers who were leaving the inn. "How pale the signora is! Does she not look anxious and frightened?" were the whispers exchanged among the group. Uneasy and irresolute Mrs. Cleveland certainly was. Horace, who, however faulty in other respects, never concealed anything from his mother, had told her of the warning of Raphael, and as he led her to the carriage, lingering and reluctant, he was warmly combating the idea that the Italian's words should have the slightest effect in influencing their movements. Doubtless he is playing into the hands of this Matteo, of whose atrocities we have been hearing, and who will be as savage as a bear at the capture of his son. Common sense tells us that we should put no faith in this stranger, a low musician, a jailbird, a companion of thieves. These words were uttered aloud, of course in the English language, but as Mrs. Cleveland glanced at the improvisatory to judge by his face whether he merited the epithets given him, she again saw a sudden flush tinge the paleness of his cheek. Raphael stepped forward, as if to help her into the carriage, for her foot was already on the step, and again in low tones breathed the words, "Do not go," but this time in English, though with an accent quite Italian. Mrs. Cleveland started, and would have drawn back, but Horace at that moment almost lifted her into the carriage, and sprang in after her with a quickness which gave his nervous mother hardly time to think or to breathe. "Horace, I can't go, I won't go. Stop the driver. We will get out," gasped the lady. "Mother, it is nonsense. You will make us the laughing-stock of the place," exclaimed Horace, who had caught sight of a leer upon the face of the one-eyed man, which had strengthened his suspicions as to the character of the low little inn in the mountains. The driver cracked his whip, and the jingle of the horses' bells was heard as they moved forward on the white, dusty road. The conscience of Horace smote him a little for the rudeness of his manner and words. "You know, mother," he said in a softer tone, "that I must care for your comfort and safety." "Comfort!" exclaimed Mrs. Cleveland with indignation. "Willful, ungrateful boy that you are, you never care for anything but your own selfish fancies." And exhausted in strength and wounded in feeling, the irritated mother burst into a flood of tears. "Mother, I can't stand this," exclaimed Horace, in extreme vexation at seeing her weep. "You have planted many a thorn in my pillow," sobbed the lady. "You may find them one day on your own." Horace could not answer. His heart seemed to be rising into his throat. He pulled his cap low over his eyes and leaned back in the corner of the carriage, wishing, with all his soul, that he had never come on the journey. He had been accustomed to chidings and reproaches, but not to tears, and each drop seemed to fall upon his heart like a drop of molten lead. Horace had never but once before seen his parent weep upon his account, and the occasion which drew forth those tears was one of the most tender recollections of his childhood. Horace remembered the time when he had lain in his little cot, parched by fever, and when awakening again and again in the long, wretched nights, he had ever seen, by the dim light of the shaded candle, the form of his mother, ready to offer the cooling drink to relieve his burning thirst. He remembered how, as long as his danger continued, her calm courage had never failed her, faith and love supporting her through sleepless nights and miserable days, but that when the doctor had said at last, "The crisis is over. He will do well," her overstrained feelings had at length given way, and she had wept tears of thankful delight over the child who lay on her bosom. How different from those glad tears were the drops which the wounded, disappointed parent was shedding now. A painful sensation came over Horace as the doubt suggested itself to his mind whether his mother would have felt such transport at his recovery had she known all that his petulance would cost her. Nay, Horace was not certain whether, on the whole, her only and much-loved son had not given her more pain than pleasure. It was too true that he had thought more of his own selfish fancies than of the wishes of his tender parent, that he had often treated her with disrespect and even with actual disobedience. Horace's conscience told him that he had not honored his mother, nor made her happy, and he was so painfully stung by its reproaches that he was half inclined to call out to the driver to go back to the inn, as a kind of practical way of showing his parent that he regretted having preferred his own opinion to hers. But the carriage was now plunging down a road so steep and narrow that it would have been almost impossible to stop it, and quite impossible to turn. The utmost attention of the driver was required to keep his horses on their legs, and every now and then a tremendous jolt made Mrs. Cleveland grasp the side of the vehicle to prevent herself from being jerked out of her seat. She had ceased crying, but she was thoroughly displeased with her son, and was not disposed to address him again, even if the roughness of the road had not rendered it difficult to speak. Horace knew that he ought to ask his mother's forgiveness at once, as he had often done when a child, but pride shrank from that simple course. As a compromise between conscience and pride, he said, with a little hesitation, "I am sorry that I spoke so unguardedly about that mysterious Italian, though who could have dreamed of anyone here comprehending the English tongue?" Mrs. Cleveland made no reply, but continued gazing out of the carriage window in an opposite direction. "And I am sorry," continued Horace with an effort, "that I said or did anything to vex you." Still silence, still the averted face. This had not been the first, no, nor the 50th time that Horace had offended his mother, and such offenses, though apparently trivial, make up in number what they lack in weight. Constant friction produces on the mind the same effect that it does on the body, a rankling sore, more painful than the result of one sharp blow. A few affectionate words, a filial embrace, had often seemed sufficient reparation for an ebullition of hasty temper. Love readily forgets and forgives, but when the conduct repented of today is repeated tomorrow, when hastiness becomes habitual, when pride and self-will gain increasing strength, what wonder if a feeling of resentment mingle even with maternal affection? Mrs. Cleveland was in a state of nervous irritation and not disposed to meet the constrained advances of her son. Deeply mortified by her silence, vexed with his mother, but far more vexed with himself, Horace again threw himself back in the carriage. No enjoyment could he find in surveying the exquisite landscape around him, over which the beams of the setting sun were now throwing a golden glory. Chapter 4. Separation. Scarcely had the upper rim of the golden sun dipped below the horizon, when the dark curtain of night was thrown over the landscape, spangled with tremulous stars. Horace was startled from his disagreeable reflections by what seemed almost like sudden darkness, and Mrs. Cleveland became yet more nervously alive to the dangers of the road, when she could no longer see their approach. Having reached the bottom of a long, steep hill, Giacomo got down from his seat and lit the carriage lamps. In reply to the lady's anxious question as to whether it would not yet be better to go back, he replied that it would now be as easy to proceed to Subtitle as to return to the inn, for the road down which they had just descended was one fitted for goats rather than for horses. Giacomo muttered and grumbled a good deal, as he remounted his seat, about the folly of having started at all, and words, though but half understood, did not tend to reassure Mrs. Cleveland. The momentary glare which the lamps threw in passing on gray rock or gloomy thicket seemed to make the darkness beyond more deep and oppressive, and the jingle of the horse bells and rumble of the wheels but drearily broke the stillness of that unfrequented road. Horace knew well that his mother was in an agony of nervous alarm, dreading to catch sight of a bandit behind every bush, and notwithstanding his natural courage, he began in some measure to share her apprehensions. Raphael's warning rang in his ears, and the more vividly memory recalled the countenance of him who had given it, the more Horace wondered at himself for having allowed so little weight to his words. Horace had often longed for an adventure, but night traveling through a wild and desolate country, known to be infested by robbers, has in it more of romance than of pleasure, even to one of courageous spirit. The road now lay through the deep recesses of a wood, where the boughs, meeting and intermingling above, formed an arch over the way and blotted out from view the few stars that had gleamed in the sky. Suddenly there was heard the sharp report of a pistol, which made Mrs. Cleveland start and shriek. The next moment, the horses were thrown violently back upon their haunches, and the lamplight dimly showed indistinct forms glancing like phantoms through the darkness. Then came wild, fierce faces at the window. The door was forced open, and the travelers dragged out of the carriage almost before they had time to be certain that all was not some terrible dream. Horace's first impulse was to defend his mother. All unarmed as he was, he struck at the man who had seized her, but received himself a sharp blow on the arm which made it drop stunned to his side. He glanced round, and that glance was sufficient to assure him that resistance would be utterly hopeless. There were at least 5 or 6 robbers around, most of them already busily engaged in rifling the carriage, and strange sounded their laughter and their jests as they drew forth now this thing, now that, dragging cloaks, bandboxes, dressing case, umbrella, fan, to be piled in a heap on the road. The bandit who had seized Mrs. Cleveland had already torn from her neck the gold chain, and with it the watch which she wore, and plunging his coarse hand into her pocket had turned it inside out, to make sure that none of its contents should escape him. Trembling as in a fit of ague, the poor lady had been constrained to pull off her gloves and draw hastily from her icy fingers the jeweled rings which adorned them. Horace was half maddened at the sight, but he had no power to protect his mother. He could but pass his left arm around her to support her from sinking, and glare at the spoilers with the vain wrath of one whose strength does not equal his spirit. Giacomo was on his knees, invoking the Virgin and all the saints to defend him. The robbers took little notice of him, save that one spurned him with his foot in passing, and another sternly bade him cease his whining, or he would dash out his brains. Amidst the confusion and terrors of the scene, Horace yet retained his self-possession sufficiently to notice that none of the bandits kept any of the plunder, but that they placed it together in the heap before mentioned, probably with a view to division. The word Matteo was also occasionally heard amid the tumult of voices, and presently every eye was turned in one direction, whence came a crashing sound as if someone were forcing his way through the brushwood. Mrs. Cleveland had sunk on the ground. Horace was kneeling beside her, half supporting her drooping form, when there strode into the dimly lighted space the tall figure of the chief of the banditti. Matteo was a large and powerful man, with a countenance on which the character of ruffianism was so legibly stamped that had he appeared in gentlemen's society under whatever auspices, with whatever name, or in whatever dress, a child would have instinctively shrunk from him, and a stranger's first thought have been, "There is one whom I would rather not meet alone at night in a solitary place." Grizzled was the shock of coarse hair thrown back from his dark face, grizzled the untrimmed beard, but his thick beetling brows were intensely black and almost joined together in one. The most repulsive feature was the mouth, of which the lower jaw projected, and which was furnished with teeth so irregular and large that they suggested the idea of the fangs of some beast of prey. The alarm of Mrs. Cleveland increased when the light fell on the countenance of the man in whose power she knew herself to be. Clasping her hands, she gasped forth in broken Italian, "Oh, mercy! We will pay ransom. We will give anything. Only spare me and my son." "Ransom," repeated Matteo in a hoarse voice. "We want from you something more than money." And turning sharply round to one of his companions, he inquired, "Has not the Rossignol returned?" "Not yet," replied the young man addressed, who, though seemingly several years older than Raphael, bore so strong a likeness to him that the first impression of the bewildered travelers had been that the musician whose warning they had neglected and whom they had left behind at the little inn had by some strange means overtaken the carriage. The second glance at Enrico had, however, quite removed such impression. The cast of the features might be alike. There might be the same classical outline, the same delicately penciled brow, but the expression of the face was utterly dissimilar. Instead of the calm thoughtfulness, tinged with melancholy, which had struck Mrs. Cleveland in the improvisatory, there was a restless wildness in this young man's eye, like that of a hunted animal, and a nervous twitch in his lip peculiarly apparent whenever he was addressed by Matteo. "Why has he not returned?" growled Matteo. "And why did he go at all?" "He went for tidings of your son, and he has not had time to return," was the answer. "If he play me false," commenced the brigand, grinding his white fangs instead of completing his sentence. "He has not played you false, or these birds would not be in your net," cried Enrico, as he pointed to Horace and his mother. Horace at once comprehended that the rossignol, the Italian word for nightingale, must be a cant name for Raphael, and that the musician, whatever might have been his motive in uttering his words of warning, must have incurred some risk by doing so. Matteo now turned again towards his captives and spoke as follows to the trembling lady, using violent gesticulation and giving emphasis to his speech with the action of hand and foot. "You know, or you do not know, that the dogs of soldiers have seized my son, that they have dragged him off to a dungeon, that the sentence of a tyrannical judge may condemn him, as it has condemned other bold spirits before him. You are rich. A golden key opens all doors, aye, even the barred and bolted gate of a prison. You shall write to the government. You shall say that you are in Matteo's hands, at Matteo's mercy. You shall tell what conditions I offer. If Otto be set free, you shall be set free. If they hurt a hair of his head." Matteo half unsheathed his stiletto, and the gleam of the cold blue steel spoke more forcibly than words. "There is little use in writing," suggested Enrico. "These people are strangers, foreigners. A mere letter is thrown aside. Blood is spilt while officials take their drive or their siesta. Asterisk, let one of the prisoners go, knowing that the life of the other hangs on the issue, and the dullest employee will be made to hear, the slowest to act. Gold will be lavished freely, and Otto be a free man again." Asterisk, the noonday sleep which Italians habitually take. Mrs. Cleveland glanced anxiously from one speaker to the other, unable to catch the whole of their meaning, but understanding in a general way the nature of a discussion in which she was so deeply concerned. "Right, right," exclaimed the robber. "We'll keep the lady and send off the boy." "No," exclaimed Horace, starting to his feet. "If a prisoner must remain in your hands, keep me and release my mother." "Oh, my child, my child," cried the lady. "Never shall they part us, never." And she stretched out her clasped hands to Matteo in an attitude of agonizing entreaty. "I'll send her," growled the brigand. "She is a mother. She will not spare cries or tears to wring mercy out of the merciless. Hear me, woman," he continued in a louder tone to the trembling supplicant before him. "You shall go to those high in power and plead for my son as you would plead for your son, and pour out your gold to those who never yet refused gold. Yea, if it were the last ducat which you possessed to keep you from beggary. If Otto be standing here in 3 days." "3 days are not enough," interrupted Enrico. "You require an impossibility. Application may have to be made to Naples, to the king himself." Aye," said the brigand impatiently. "Naples is more than a stone's throw, and time may be needed, even though love and fear alike give wings. If, woman, in 7 days my son be standing here free and uninjured," Matteo stamped on the ground as he spake, "free and uninjured shall your son be restored. If there be an hour's delay," Matteo uttered with an oathsome threat which the lady could not understand, but of its horrible nature she could judge both by the gesture of him who made it and by the livid paleness which overspread the face of her son. "Orasi." "What does he say?" she exclaimed. "Never mind, mother. It was something that you had better not understand. You know quite enough. You know that my life depends upon your procuring within 7 days the release of this Otto, this son of Matteo." Horace spake less distinctly than usual, and even his lips looked bloodless and white. Matteo turned to the heap of plunder. "Is everything here?" he sternly inquired. "Everything," promptly replied several voices. The brigand pointed to Giacomo. "Make that fellow take the reins again," he said, "and drive as one who drives for his life. Thrust the woman back into the carriage. She must be at Subtitle within the hour." 2 or 3 rude hands were instantly laid on Mrs. Cleveland, but she clung to her son as if it were to death instead of to liberty and safety that she was to be hurried. In that moment of terror and anguish, all his faults and her own perils were forgotten. The mother thought only of her child. To tear her from him was to rend asunder the very strings of her heart. "Mother, dear, don't give way like this. There's no use resisting, no use entreating. We may yet meet again. All may be well. Don't you give these wretches an excuse for treating you roughly." And as he uttered these broken sentences, Horace tried gently himself to unclose those clinging arms. It was only, however, by sheer force that the robbers tore Mrs. Cleveland away from her boy, and her cry as they were severed rang in the ears of Horace like a death knell. He had a terrible persuasion at that moment that he was parted from his mother never to see her again. A crowd of recollections rushed through the youth's brain, a consciousness that he had been a self-willed, undutiful son, that his conduct had caused all this misery, that he had forgiveness to implore for 1,000 faults, and yet that his tongue had no power to ask for it. Horace saw his mother dragged to the carriage, and rather thrown than lifted into it. From her silence after that one cry, he believed that her senses must have failed her, and was almost thankful for that belief. He saw a robber strike one of the horses with something that made it, weary as it was, bound forward with such frantic violence that Giacomo was almost unseated. His exclamation of terror raised hoarse laughter from the lawless band, and before that laughter had ceased, the carriage with its gleaming lamps had disappeared in the darkness, and Horace stood, helpless and alone, a captive in the midst of banditti. Chapter 2. Rough company. If one feeling were more overpowering than another to Horace at that trying hour, it was the pang of remorse, despair of ever being able to make up by devotion in the future for ingratitude and disobedience in the past. Oh, that the selfish and self-willed would anticipate the hour of final separation from one whose tender love they are now throwing away as a worthless thing, under whose reproofs they chafe, for whose infirmities they have no indulgence. A time may come when they will in vain wish that by the loss of every earthly possession they could purchase one smile from the eyes, one fond word from the lips of a now neglected parent. Horace was roused from his gloomy thoughts by the hoarse voice of Matteo. "Has anyone brought the irons?" he said. With a heavy clanking sound, a robber threw down on the ground an old pair of shackles, red with rust, which had, probably at some remote period, been worn by one of the band. Matteo pointed with his coarse finger to Horace, a significant action which required no explanation. As the fetters were being fastened over the slender ankles of the youth, the chief bade Enrico take charge of the prisoner, for whose safety he should answer with his own. Then followed a division of the spoil. Mrs. Cleveland's dressing case and desk were forced open with a dagger, the contents of her purse counted out, the various articles of her luggage placed in separate heaps. Reserving almost all the gold for himself, Matteo distributed his booty. Most of the robbers looked discontented, but not one dared to utter a murmur. Horace saw with bitter emotion his mother's most valued trinkets in these rude hands, the Maltese cross which he himself had given, the mourning brooch with his father's hair, nay, the very wedding ring which had united his parents, were profaned by the touch of fingers which might be stained with murder. These papers, some of them priceless to her who had once owned them, were thrown away or trampled underfoot. Matteo beckoned Enrico to some little distance, apparently to give him some orders, and their departure seemed to be the signal for more unrestrained and lawless mirth. Then also the murmurs which had been checked by the presence of the dreaded chief broke out amongst such of the band as had been disappointed in their share of the plunder. "What am I to make of trumpery like this?" exclaimed one robber, holding up to view with great contempt a silver-gray cloak with a hood, a black gown, a lace-trimmed parasol, and a fan. His appeal was answered by a roar of laughter. "You may set up for a gentlewoman, Beppo," shouted one. "My share matches yours," laughed another. "You've the dress, and I've the dressing case." With silver tops to all the bottles, growled Beppo. I'll make an exchange if you will. The offer was only received with a louder burst of merriment, and the disappointed Beppo turned fiercely towards Horace. Here's a garment more to my mind, he cried, and flinging down his bundle of woman's clothes, the robber seized hold of the indignant and struggling captive, and by force dispossessed him of his coat. The gang gathered around, much amused at the scene, laughing uproariously at the vain, passionate resistance of Horace. There's more peel on the orange, cried one, and the young captive might have had to submit to further indignities had not Enrico come to the rescue. Hold, he cried. The prisoner is in my charge. No one has a right to touch him but me. For 7 days, said Beppo significantly, he'll want no clothes after that. And putting out his large, coarse foot, he added with a laugh, in 7 days, I'll have hosen and boots. I take it that his will just fit me. It's a shame to dig a man's grave before his eyes, exclaimed Enrico. Shame, repeated Beppo angrily. Don't come at your brother over us. It's enough to have one lunatic in a family, say I. Without taking any notice of the insult, Enrico touched Horace on the shoulder and bade him come with him, which the youth was ready enough to do, it being an unutterable relief to him to be removed, even for a short time, from the company of the rest of the lawless band. Enrico led his captive into the deep recesses of the wood, seeming to find his way by instinct through the darkness, in which shining fireflies glanced and played. Horace envied them their liberty. He walked with difficulty and pain. His fetters not only impeded his movements, but chafed his ankles. He stumbled over the inequalities of the ground, struck against branches which he could not see, and his chain caught and entangled in brambles, and he often felt inclined to throw himself down on the ground in utter despair of getting on. Enrico neither pitied nor appeared to notice his sufferings, but hurried him on through the thicket. Horace, who, notwithstanding his fetters, grasped strongly the hope of future escape, was eagerly on the watch for landmarks, and strained his eyes in the darkness to find some. The rippling sound of water and the occasional glimpse which he caught through the trees of what appeared to be a stream seemed to supply something like a guide. His hope strengthened as the noise increased so greatly that Horace felt certain that they were approaching a cataract plunging down the side of the mountain. The roar of waters could not be mistaken, though nothing was visible to the eye. Before Enrico reached what must be the head of the fall, he turned sharply round to the left, and grasping his captive by the wrist, made him follow in the same direction. Is there not a cataract yonder? Asked Horace. It was the first time that he had addressed his jailer. Sheer 200 feet over the rocks, was the reply. We call it Cascata della Morte, the death fall, for a miserable wretch was once whirled over the edge. And perished, inquired Horace. As surely, answered Enrico, as if he had flung himself from the top of St. Peter's or down into the crater of Vesuvius. The remains, when recovered from the stream in the valley yonder, scarcely retained semblance of the human form. Horace hardly paid attention to the concluding words. He was so carefully surveying the path before him. He had left the thick wood behind him, and had now to pass along a ledge of rock, which seemed like a shelf jutting out of the mountain, and which overhung a precipice of whose depth there was not sufficient light to enable him to judge. To Horace, a vast chasm of darkness appeared to spread to the right. Here Enrico and his prisoner were challenged by a robber who had been left as a sentinel to guard this dangerous post. "Qui va là?" "Who goes there?" cried the man. Enrico gave the word "mort" and passed on with his captive. "I think that I might possibly find my way back from hence to the high road," thought Horace, "with the sound of the water to guide me, were I only freed from these shackles. But if a sentinel be always placed here on the watch, it would render escape well nigh impossible. One blow would send one reeling over that rock into depths that it makes the brain dizzy to think of." Enrico now again struck into the forest, and here the path became so very intricate that Horace soon lost all idea even of the direction in which he was going, all clue by which he might find his way back. The path was so much tangled with thicket that the progress of Enrico and his prisoner became necessarily very slow, and Horace soon became not only exhausted, but despairing. It was some time since a word had been exchanged, but as they toiled on through the brushwood, Enrico said abruptly to his companion, "You need not fear insult from me, for I, like yourself, am a gentleman born. My father was of good family. He was an officer in the royal army and died in the service of the king." "Then how can you—" Horace stopped short, being afraid of saying something that might offend. "How can I consort with such ruffians?" you would ask. No matter. That is no business of yours. Men may be bound by other kind of chain than that which you drag so wearily along. There was extreme bitterness in the young man's tone, and though Horace could not see the face of the speaker in the gloom, he imagined how the thin lip was twitching and the restless eye wandering around. Horace was anxious to ascertain to a certainty whether Raphael were the brother to whom reference had been made, and who had been spoken of as the Rossignol, but he was afraid of drawing the improvisatore into difficulty or danger by letting it be known that he had ever seen him. As a leading question, Horace asked Enrico whether he knew English, remembering that Raphael had uttered his second warning in that language. "No. Is it likely that I should?" answered the robber. Foiled in his first attempt to gain information, Horace made another. "Why did that fellow call your brother a lunatic?" said he. "Because he is one," replied Enrico impatiently. "None but a madman would be always putting his head into the lion's mouth, certain that it must be bitten off at last." "Does he belong to the band?" asked Horace. "Yes, no. What is it to you?" cried Enrico. This rebuff put an end to the conversation, though it increased the desire of Horace to know more of the mysterious Raphael, for he was now certain that the stranger at the door of the inn was the brother of the bandit Enrico. At length the long tangled forest was passed, and the way opened on a rocky space, where, by the faint starlight, no longer hidden by foliage, Horace saw a bold, partially wooded cliff rising before them, a gigantic mass of gloomy shade. Horace had little opportunity, however, of remarking anything but the difficulty of the ascent, as progression here took the character of climbing, which the fetters on his limbs made a terrible effort. "It is impossible for me to get up, chained as I am," exclaimed Horace, after having rubbed the skin from one of his ankles, in a vain attempt to raise himself to a platform of rock. "Impossible," echoed Enrico, with a short, mocking laugh. "It must be done, and the sooner better, or Matteo will be here to quicken your movements with the point of his stiletto." Once again Horace tried to get up, the moisture dewing his lip and brow, both from the pain and the exertion, but cumbered as he was with his shackles, he could not succeed. Then Enrico, growing impatient, lent a strong hand to help him. Even with this assistance, it was with the utmost difficulty that the suffering youth reached the platform. He stopped for some moments to recover his breath and to wipe his heated temples. "Could you find your way back?" said Enrico. "The woods seem to me to be a perfect labyrinth." "Then there is no chance of your attempting an escape?" "I fear that I have more will than power to escape," replied the young captive with a sigh. "Do you know what would follow your making any such attempt?" "Perhaps," began Horace. "Most assuredly," interrupted Enrico, "I should send a bullet through your head. This gentleman, as he calls himself, is not much better than the rest," was the silent reflection of Horace. A few more steps, and the two had reached the mouth of a cave which yawned in the mountain, its mouth half hidden by a thick growth of cactus, which abounded as a weed in this place. Horace was glad to have arrived at his destination, whatever it might be, for he felt that he could not for many minutes more have endured the exhausting effort of dragging his fettered feet over the rocks. Chapter 6. The Robber's Cave. Enrico, followed by his prisoner, groped his way through the cave, and then along a passage in the rock too low to admit of their standing upright. The dampness of the air, the darkness of the place, made the unhappy Horace feel as though he were entering a tomb. They soon, however, emerged into a very spacious cavern of irregular shape, at one side of which was some light. This light, as Horace soon perceived, came from two wax tapers, burning in front of an image of the Virgin. The feeble gleam served only to make darkness visible, not reaching at all to the roof of the cave, and showing but little even of its brown rugged wall. The place was tenanted by bats, which wheeled around in circling flights, seeming to Horace's fevered imagination like spirits of evil haunting the robber's cave. The youth watched with curiosity to see whether Enrico would cross himself or bow on passing the image, and as he did neither, the prisoner ventured upon a remark. "I should hardly have expected to see that here," he said, pointing to the shrine. "Why so?" asked his companion. "Because," answered Horace, trying to put his reply in the least offensive form, "I should not have thought Matteo a man to care for religion." "That shows how little you know about him," said Enrico. "Some of your mother's good ducats will go to a fat friar for masses, that the rest may be enjoyed with an easy conscience, and though Matteo has not scrupled to rob a traveler on this Friday, nothing would persuade him to touch a morsel of meat." "Is it possible," exclaimed Horace, "that a man can so deceive his own soul?" "None of that talk here," cried Enrico, with gesture of irritation. "We have more of it than we like, and will never stand it from you." "From whom can they hear it?" thought the astonished Horace. "One would as little expect to hear truth as to find honesty in a den like this." Enrico now lighted a torch which was fastened in the rock a few feet above a long low table, which Horace now for the first time perceived, and which, with the rude benches on each side of it, seemed to form all the furniture of the place. On it were ranged sundry flagons, bottles of wine, and other preparations for a meal. "I suppose that while you are our prisoner, you will partake of our fare," said Enrico. "Will you join our jovial party at supper tonight, or shall I at once introduce you to the luxuries of our private apartment, the elegant chamber which you are to share with me and my brother?" Enrico's tone was satirical, and there was indescribable bitterness in his smile. "If you could possibly keep me apart from the band tonight, I should be thankful," said Horace. "I am parched with thirst, but I have not the slightest inclination to eat food." Enrico went up to the table and filled a large tankard with water, which Horace eagerly drained. He then bade the prisoner to follow him, and a little more, to Horace. Painful clambering up rude stony steps brought them to a recess in the side of the cave, about 10 feet above the floor, and overlooking the table. It was so utterly dark that it was by feeling and not by sight that young Cleveland became aware that there was a heap of dry leaves upon the rocky floor. "As the Rossignol has not returned," said Enrico, "you may take possession of his bed. I warrant it that you have been accustomed to a more soft and dainty couch. I must go below to prepare the banquet." So saying, Enrico groped his way back to the floor of the cavern, while Horace, dizzy and bewildered by the strange events of the night, gave a deep sigh of relief at finding himself in comparative solitude. He threw himself down on the heap of leaves, resting his burning forehead on his arm, and tried to collect his scattered thoughts and realize his position. What a strange, wild place this is. Shall I ever leave it alive? Shall I ever look upon the sunshine, or feel the pure breath of heaven? What horrors these walls may have witnessed! Could they speak, what fearful tales of crime might they disclose? And it is more than probable that, ere a week shall have passed, another may be added to the list. Horace changed his position in feverish restlessness, and a sharp thrill of pain reminded him of the fetters on his limbs. There would be none to lift a hand, or to speak a word in my defense. No, nor to feel pity for my youth, whatever I might have to endure. Even this Enrico, who seems somewhat less brutal than the rest, would shoot me dead on the spot rather than suffer his captive to escape. Oh, my mother, my poor mother, how little you ever expected your son to be in such a situation as this. Then Horace recalled how, ever since he could remember, his parent had been wont to come and sit at night by his bedside, stroke back his curly hair, and talk to him of holy things, and tell him how much she loved him. These nightly visits, once a pleasure to both, had within the last year become a cause of painful feeling between Horace and his mother. The youth had grown jealous of being treated like a child, It had annoyed him to be disturbed from his desk or some interesting book by the entrance of his mother at her regular hour, to be chidden for sitting up late, or warned of the danger of fire. Horace had become so impatient the interruption, the reproof and the warning, that he had at last actually locked his door, answering his mother's good night, without turning the key to admit her. Mrs. Cleveland had been deeply wounded. Horace hardly guessed how deeply, but it was agony now upon this his first night of captivity to recall the sound of her step in the passage, the tone of her plaintive good night, and to think that that step, that voice, might be heard by his ear no more. Oh, why had he not loved her better? Why had he not always welcomed the presence of one so dear? With this train of thought came linked another. It was not only in filial piety that Horace Cleveland had failed. His neglect had not been only towards his mother. Carefully brought up as he had been, the youth had, with tolerable regularity, observed the outward forms of religion, and conscience had been easily satisfied that all was right with his soul. Horace had mistaken reverence for devotion, and belief in God's truth for faith. But such a shadow of religion could not support him under the pressure of real trials, or make tolerable the prospect of death. It had no strength or solidity in it. Horace could not realize the presence of a heavenly Father in the dark, gloomy cave, nor was the psalmist's assurance his. The Lord is my light and any salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? In courage and spirit he was by no means deficient, but human courage and spirit will bend under the pressure of protracted trial. That terrible walk in shackles had for the time exhausted the energies of Horace, and in that gloomy abode of evil, he felt desolate and wretched indeed. Even the comfort of silence was soon taken from the prisoner. Before many minutes had elapsed, a wild uproar of voices announced the approach of the band. One by one the robbers emerged from the low passage which united the outer and inner caves, some bearing spoil, and some bearing torches, which threw a wild, red glare on their dark faces and picturesque dress. Horace counted 8 bandits, including Enrico. The men sat noisily down at the table. Matteo and some others had their seats near the wall, and were so immediately under Horace that he could not see them, without stretching his head so far forward that he would himself have been exposed to the observation of the robbers, which he anxiously desired to avoid. But while remaining under cover of the darkness of his recess, Horace had full view of Enrico and 3 of his companions, who sat opposite to their chief. I shall not enter into details of what, with disgust and horror, Horace saw and heard on that night, the oaths, the tales, the songs of the coarsest description, the sounds of wild revel, the burst of laughter strangely echoing through the recesses of the vaulted cave, till it seemed as though fields unseen shouted and laughed again. Enrico, laying aside his former manner, appeared to be the gayest of the gay, plunging into the torrent of unholy mirth as though he sought to drown all memory and all remorse. Horace tried to shut out from his own ears the sounds of profane merriment, but he tried in vain. It seemed to his loathing mind that if one black spot were to be found on earth, where evil, unmixed evil, reigned triumphant, where faith was quite shut out, where heavenly hope could not come, that spot was the robber's cave in the depth of the Calabrian mountain. Music and madness. Ah! The Rossignol come at last, shouted Beppo, as a low, clear whistle was heard in the dark passage. Horace looked down eagerly and saw the slight form of Raphael as he came forth from the gloom, bearing his instrument of music. The young Calabrian looked exceedingly weary. He made a slight inclination of the head on entering towards the place where Horace knew that the chief was. He then laid his guitar against the rocky wall and sat down on a vacant seat beside his brother Enrico. "What news of Otto?" cried Matteo, whose voice was easily recognized amongst the rest by its peculiar harshness. "I could gain no tidings beyond those which have already reached you," replied Raphael, in low, rich tones, which formed as strong a contrast to the discordant sounds which had lately prevailed, as his appearance did to that of his companions. "He was, as you know, conveyed by a strong military escort towards Stytai, thence to be taken to Reggio. He had not been able to communicate with anyone at the inn, access to him being strictly forbidden by the officer in charge." Something that sounded like a curse burst from the lips of Matteo. "And what are your news?" inquired Raphael, with what seemed to Horace a somewhat anxious air. One of the robbers replied with a laugh, "Some good business done today. English travelers are always worth the plucking. It will take you some time with your curing and your caroling to bring in the value of a plaything like this." And he held up the glittering gold chain which had been torn from the neck of Mrs. Cleveland. "Any bloodshed?" inquired Raphael quickly, resting his clenched hand on the table and sternly regarding the last speaker. When a short account of what had occurred was given to him, the improvisatore looked relieved, and Horace instinctively felt that he had a friend in the man whom he had called to his face a low musician, a jailbird, a companion of thieves. Raphael bent towards his brother and whispered some question, to which Enrico replied by glancing up towards the recess occupied by the captive, then heaping food upon a trencher which was before the Rossignol. He bade him eat and drink and refresh himself after his long walk. Raphael shook his head and pushed the trencher away. "If you will not eat, you shall sing," cried Matteo. "Beppo here has a voice which he might have borrowed from a raven, and Marco's is like a muffled drum. We've not had a singer worth listening to since Carlo was shot in the wood." Raphael did not appear much more disposed to sing than to eat, but Matteo spoke like one whose will was a law which few would have dared to oppose, and the musician, albeit reluctantly, laid his hand on the guitar. "Give us the jovial old Spanish drinking song, with the bolero, give it out bold and free," exclaimed Beppo. "I shall choose my own song," replied Raphael coldly, "and sing it in what manner I list." "A madman's theme must be madness," cried the ill-favored robber. "Be it so," answered the Rossignol. "Although I accept not your name, I take the word as my subject. Madness shall be my theme." He struck a few chords with a light, bold hand, and the silvery sound in that fearful place seemed like the tones of an angel's harp. In an instant, all other noise was so completely hushed that Horace could hear distinctly the slow drip of water distilling from the roof of the cave. The attention of the robbers deepened as, after a short prelude, Rossignol began to sing. His exquisite voice poured forth in a wild and original air, sometimes rapid and almost gay, but at the close of every verse ending in a minor key, and in tones of such deep pathos that they sounded like a dirge from the dead or a wail for the lost. Horace had often listened to music, but he had never before heard such music as this. In others he had felt sweet song a charm, but in Raphael it was a power. It was a spell which kept chained in almost breathless silence the reckless beings whose fierce passions brooked no restraint either of law or conscience. Madness. A wanderer stood by a rapid stream, when a scroll unto him was brought. 'Twas a father's message of love, addressed to one whose childhood his care had blessed. 'Twas an offer of pardon, peace, and rest. But the prodigal whom he sought only flung the scroll from the river's brink, and watched it slowly and slowly sink. Oh, madman, to break love's golden link! On a hill stood a poor wayfaring man, when a parchment to him was given, by which he was proved the rightful heir to all the broad region before him there, the wooded valleys and meadows fair, bounded but by the arch of heaven. But with reckless hand he the parchment tore, and the breezes afar the fragments bore. Oh, madman, that wealth can be thine no more. A doomed man crouched o'er his prison fire. His heart for his fate he steeled. Already he heard the castle bell boom drearily forth his dying knell, when his eye on a royal writing fell. 'Twas his pardon, signed and sealed. But he flung the pardon into the flame, and so went forth to a death of shame. Oh, madman, well hast thou earned the name. Almost as well, exclaimed Beppo, as the rhymer who could make such a song. Sing to us of men of flesh and blood, for the world holds no such fools as those in your ballad. They be more unnatural than the ghosts and goblins of nursery rhymes. For the matter of that, observed Marco, another of the robbers, there's many a prodigal I wot of has thrown his father's letter away. But to tear a deed of inheritance, throw a pardon into the fire, nothing so wild, so improbable was ever yet said or sung. Such mad freaks as those are not played by men even in their dreams. Are you sure of that? Asked the Rossignol, while his fingers, as if unconsciously, wandered over the strings of his guitar. Is the song ended? Said Matteo. Not ended, but you have heard enough, was the answer of the improvisatore. Let's hear it out, cried the chief. Let's hear it out, echoed the bandits. Again rose the rich, full tones, but with deeper emphasis, more thrilling expression. Such madmen amongst us live and dwell. Such madmen amongst us die. A father's message is heard, forgot. A treasure offered, accepted not. Men wildly prefer the demon's lot to freedom and life on high. A king's free pardon, a parent's day. Infinite wealth may be theirs today. Oh, madmen, to cast them all away. The song ceased. There was an instant of deep stillness, and then Beppo flung a tankard at the head of the speaker, as his comment on a moral so unwelcome. By a quick movement, Raphael avoided the blow. Enrico glanced fiercely at Beppo. The Rossignol laid his hand on his brother's arm, as if to restrain him from expression of anger, and without taking any other notice of the insult, arose from his seat. The countenances of the banditti, as Horace looked down upon them, would have been a study for a painter. The music had a very different effect upon its various hearers. Beppo's face was flushed with passion, while over that of Marco, a powerful man who sat next to him, gathered a gloomy scowl. A third wore a mocking sneer, a glance that seemed to say that while he admired the music, he cared nothing for the moral of the song. Enrico's expression, after the glance of indignation had passed away, was that of silent misery which he made a vain effort to conceal. The bow might have been drawn at a venture, but in one heart the barbed arrow was rankling. And there stood the Rossignol, calm and intrepid, as one not unconscious of danger, but raised above its fear. Horace looked with wondering curiosity at the man who could dare to sing such a lay in such a place, and marveled what mysterious link could bind his fate with that of ruffians with whom it appeared that he could have no feeling in common. Even as regarded Enrico, when Horace now looked upon the two brothers and contrasted them with each other, he could hardly conceive how he had ever traced a resemblance between them. The noise of the falling tankard clattering on the rocky floor was succeeded by that of the fist of Matteo coming heavily down upon the table, as if in anger. When the chief spoke, however, he made no allusion to the song. That it had offended him could only be gathered from the increased savageness of his tone. It is time to disperse. Mountain wolves, away to your dens. The command was instantly obeyed. For a few moments, noise and uproar prevailed, and as the wild band scattered in various directions, torches flashed hither and thither in the hot, murky air. Horace watched the retreating form of Beppo, as the light which he carried showed a deeper recess of the cave than he had been able to see before, with glistening stalactites hanging from the roof, and when he turned to look for the Rossignol, found that he had disappeared from his view. Remembering that Raphael was to share his own rocky chamber, Horace awaited his coming with interest and impatience. There was a step on the rough stair, if such that might be called, that seemed framed by nature and not by man, which led to the upper recess, and someone entered, but in the darkness Horace knew not whether it were Raphael or Enrico. The comber threw himself down on a heap of leaves not far from Horace, and either imagining the captive to be asleep, or, as was more probable, forgetting his presence altogether, gave a heavy groan as if in pain. That sound assuredly did not come from the Rossignol's lips. Horace lay for some time perfectly still, listening to the drip-drip of water and the deep sighs of his unseen companion, and awaiting the coming of Raphael, till, weary as he was, sleep overcame the young captive. Chapter 8. A Dash for Freedom. The summer morning had dawned, and though no direct ray could ever enter the inner cave, Horace could see the reflection of pure rosy light tinging the rugged stone, hundreds of feet above him, through a cleft in the rocky roof, which appeared as if it had been rent asunder by the shock of an earthquake. Most refreshing to the captive's eye was even that reflected gleam, which showed that the sun was shining upon earth, though not upon him, and he longed for wings to fly upwards through that lofty cleft to the glorious daylight beyond. Horace half raised himself on his elbow and looked around him. Not 2 yards from the spot on which he rested, he saw the kneeling form of Raphael, who was evidently engaged in prayer. The sight of him was to Horace like the sight of the sunlit rocks, something to witness to the existence of heaven's light even in this abode of darkness. On the other side lay Enrico asleep, and the quiet which prevailed through the cave showed that the day wagged but little advanced. After a brief space of time, Raphael arose from his knees, and, turning towards Horace, perceived by the dim light that the captive was awake. "How have you slept?" he asked in Italian, addressing Horace in the third-person singular, which, in that language, is a token of respect. Even this trifling mark of courtesy was grateful to the unfortunate youth. "I slept but ill," replied Horace. "How could I look for pleasant slumbers here?" "The bed is but a hard one," said the Rossignol, "to one who has been accustomed to a softer pillow, though custom has made its roughness no hardship to us. Yonder, where the water drips, nature has formed a simple basin where you may find refreshment in bathing your weary limbs." Horace attempted to rise, but the clambering of the previous night had made his fetters gall him so severely that every movement was pain. Raphael saw his distress. "I know too well what it is to wear such anklets," said he. "Can you not free me from them?" exclaimed Horace. The Rossignol shook his head. "I cannot free you from them," he said, "but I can render their effects less painful," and he drew from a little hole in the side of the rock some lint and ointment, which, kneeling down, he at once began to apply to the captive's swollen ankles. The touch of his hand was gentle as a woman's, and Horace felt grateful for the relief imparted. "I regret that I spoke of you as I did yesterday," said the youth, remembering his insulting manner and the words at the door of the inn. "It is not at once that we know either our friends or our foes," replied Raphael. "But you will be my friend, I know it. I can trust you," exclaimed Horace, an eager hope arising in his heart, and, speaking in English in a low, rapid tone, he offered the Italian a large reward, 1,000 ducats, 2, 3, if he would aid him in effecting his escape, and so restore him to freedom and safety. Raphael knitted his brows and shook his head sadly in reply. "It would be a noble deed. It would be to rescue a fellow creature from danger." "And to deliver my only brother to death," interrupted Raphael, pointing to the sleeper at his side. "Matteo would never. Matteo has vowed that Enrico shall answer for your safe keeping with his life. Matteo never breaks such a vow," said Raphael, speaking in imperfect English. "But he cannot be such a ruffian as to murder his own follower," pursued Horace, who was unwilling to let go his only hope of escape. "He would do it, nor would it be for the first time," said Raphael, his face darkening with some recollection of horror. It was not by the hand of soldier or executioner that Carlo perished in the wood. Horace felt the blood run cold in his veins, yet his intense desire for freedom made him once more return to the subject. "If Matteo be so merciless," he said, "how dared you provoke his anger last night?" "I had my message to give, and I gave it," replied the improvisatore. "He who builds on the brink of a volcano does so with the knowledge that the lava may one day overflow. Yet do I stand on vantage ground, and Matteo would bear from me what he would bear from no one beside." "Why so?" inquired young Cleveland. "He has an old wound in his thigh, which, having been imperfectly healed, has broken out afresh. Having gained, when I was very young, some slight knowledge of surgery from my grandfather, I am able to afford him such aid as the chief would be loath to lose. Besides," continued Raphael, "Matteo has a passionate love for melody, the one softening quality yet left him, and words are endured when clothed in music which, without it, would be perilous in the utterance. I must now depart. The band usually pursue their work at dusk, but mine requires the daylight." Raphael now spoke in his native tongue, being so little conversant with English that he was obliged, when using that language, to interpolate many words from his own. "Do not leave me," exclaimed Horace, who already looked upon the Rossignol as his only earthly protector. "There is a villager sick, perhaps dying, whom I must see, and others who must not vainly expect me. I will, please heaven, return before dark, and will, ere I go, bring you food to supply the wants of the day." So saying, Raphael with a light step descended the rude steps which led to the body of the cave, and soon returned with a plentiful supply of better fare than Horace would have expected to find in such a place. His appetite was now keen, as he had eaten nothing since he had left the inn on the mountain. "How shall I ever repay you for your kindness to a prisoner?" he said to Raphael. "I shall ask a favor of you this evening," replied the Rossignol, "which, if granted, will richly repay any slight services which I can render. I must go now. The day advances, but I leave you with little anxiety, while Otto lives, your life is perfectly safe from any deed of violence. Annoyance or insult you may have to endure, but a brave youth, as I doubt not that you are, can endure hardness like a good soldier of the cross." The last words, and the glance which accompanied them, acted on the spirit of Horace like the sound of a trumpet. Refreshed by his morning ablutions and the food of which he had partaken, not only the youth's bodily frame felt invigorated, but his mind rebounded from its late depression with all the elasticity of hope. There were 1,000 chances, Horace thought, in his favor. His mother would succeed in her efforts to effect his exchange with the bandit son, or the government would be roused to send an overwhelming force to crush the robbers. Even failing this, Matteo himself might be bribed to release his captive, or Raphael, moved by generous compassion, aid him to effect his escape. But why should he wait for Raphael? The thought darted into the mind of Horace as he concluded his substantial meal. Could he not, without any assistance, recover the freedom which he had lost? Young Cleveland glanced eagerly around below, his heart throbbing high at the idea of such a feat as would establish his reputation as a hero for the rest of his days. The cavern was still perfectly quiet. The very bats had retired to rest. There was nothing but the sleeping figure of Enrico to betoken that the place was inhabited by any living creature but himself. The entrance was not bolted or barred. When Raphael had departed through the aperture, which was only distinguishable from the walls of the cave by its more intense blackness, no sentinel had challenged him for a password. Horace recollected, indeed, with uneasiness, that a robber had kept guard on the ledge of rock, but he hoped that at an hour so early as the present, no such precaution might be deemed needful. There must be danger, indeed, in an attempt to escape, but had not the peril in itself a certain indefinable charm? Horace had often longed for an adventure. Here was one which had in it enough of romance to satisfy the most chivalrous spirit. The only thing which presented any real difficulty to the boy's sanguine mind was the bondage of his fetters. They not only cruelly impeded his movements, but made such a clanking as he walked that it was certain to rouse the robbers. If Horace were once beyond the cave, the noise would signify less, but in that vaulted, echoing chamber, every sound was troubled. As his only resource, the youth half reclined on the rock and holding up the chain with one hand, so that the iron should not touch the stone, with the other, he helped to propel himself along in a slow and most uncomfortable manner. Tedious and awkward as was this method of progression, it had at least the merit of being noiseless, and every yard crept over seemed to Horace to be a gigantic stride towards freedom. But, oh, how distant seemed that yawning chasm through which the fugitive must make his way. How often he stopped in breathless anxiety to listen for sounds of pursuit. At length the nearer end of the rocky passage was gained, and still perfect quiet reigned around. After their midnight revel, the bandits' slumbers were heavy and long. Horace had not crept far through the passage when the increasing light and the freshening air told of his approach to the outer world. He was so eager and impatient to reach it that the crouching position and slow progress to which he was confined became almost intolerably irksome. Horace had a vivid recollection of Enrico's threat, and the idea of being struck down like a rat in its hole, or shot in the back, without the possibility of flight or resistance, increased the intensity of his desire to get beyond the perilous passage. Horace reached the outer cave, which was light in comparison to that which he had quitted, though the entrance was much overgrown with plants. It opened upon the radiant east, and vivid though broken rays of sunshine were streaking with bright lines the rugged pavement and walls. "Oh, blessed sunlight!" exclaimed the prisoner with transport, as, pushing the mantling foliage aside, he made his way into the open air and sprang to his feet, feeling in the action as though he already were almost free. Bright was the morning, splendid the view which the rocky platform without the cave commanded. An ocean of waving forests spread downwards, almond, olive, and palm, with a thick growth of underwood between, a wilderness of foliage, a labyrinth of wood, clothing the mountainside, more than halfway up which the robber's den was situated. Horace had, however, no time now to indulge in admiration, or even to enjoy the sensation caused by the delicious air, and the knowledge that one great difficulty had been surmounted. He began at once to search anxiously for a downward path. The platform in front of the cave could only be quitted by descending such a rough, precipitous wall of rock that a false step must have been fraught danger. Horace, 12 hours before, might have gone down rapidly enough, but what was practicable to unfettered limbs was utterly impracticable to him now. "I should but break a limb by attempting to get down," exclaimed the almost despairing youth, after surveying again and again the rugged steep. "I cannot conceive how I ever mounted these rocks. Enrico dragged me up by sheer strength, or even his benevolent hint as to the quickening power of Matteo's stiletto would never have enabled me to climb. And even were I unshackled, and able to spring from rock to rock, by what clue could I find my way through that dense woodland before me? It shuts me in as effectually as bars and bolts could do. Oh, misery, to be thus mocked with the hope of freedom, only to find that, after all my exertions, it is impossible to escape." Horace was startled by a rough grasp on his shoulder. Turning sharply round, he beheld Enrico. "So you thought to give us the slip," exclaimed the bandit, significantly pointing to a pistol he carried in his belt. "Think you that if there had been a chance of our bird's escaping, we should not have clipped his wings more closely?" "Oh, Enrico!" exclaimed Horace with passionate earnestness, "you can help me. You can set me free. A file would be worth its weight in gold. Strike off my fetters, guide me through the wood, and the richest reward." "Name it again, and I'll strike you dead," cried Enrico, his sallow countenance assuming almost a livid hue. "You are miserable here. Your life is." Enrico gnashed his teeth with passion. "Whatever my life here may be," he exclaimed, "I am not going to fling it away in a mad attempt to rescue a stranger. Miserable I may be, but not insane enough to draw down upon my head the vengeance of a man who never forgives, and who, when he singles out a foe, never fails to make him a victim. Have I not seen Carlo lying in his blood? There is not one man in the band who would aid you to baffle Matteo, though you should promise him to fill that cave to the roof with silver and gold." And with these words on his lips, the robber turned and retired into the darkness of the cavern, leaving Horace to meditate on the desperate character of his own situation. Chapter 9. Anxious Hours. How unwilling is youth to part with hope, how it clings even to its shadow. Believing against the evidence of his senses that what was so desirable could not be impossible, Horace only desisted from attempts to descend the rocks, when, in making them, he had hurt his ankle so severely that he would have cried aloud with anguish had he not feared that the sound might be overheard by the robbers. With a very heavy heart, the unhappy captive then dragged his chain to a little cleared space, a few yards higher than the entrance to the cave, where the roots of an oak offered a rude seat. Here Horace Cleveland rested his aching limbs, and leaning his head on his hands, gave himself up to anxious thought. Still his mind was running upon chances of escape. Horace recalled the words of Raphael which had surprised him when they were uttered. "I shall ask a favor of you which, if granted, will richly repay any services that I can render." What favor could a prisoner possibly have it in his power to grant? Raphael must be anticipating his release and his restoration to a position in which he could largely reward any kindness which he now might receive. Perhaps the young Italian hoped that Horace might procure his pardon from the King of Naples for some crime, the commission of which had driven one born for better things to seek the shelter of a robber's den. Perhaps the free pardon of Enrico might be the desired boon. Horace's thoughts rambled on through paths almost as mazy as the forest before him. He would place Raphael in the way of distinguishing himself. Raphael was the son of an officer and bore the stamp of a gentleman. With his singular talents, he would grace any society and might raise himself to a high position. Horace had already begun to feel a strong interest in his mysterious friend, whose character and situation afforded to the youth's mind an enigma which he was curious to solve. Raphael certainly kept evil company, and a man may be known by his chosen associates. The girl at the inn had more than hinted doubts regarding his character. The Rossignol had himself confessed that he had once worn shackles, which confirmed Giuseppina's report that he had known the inside of a prison. But, on the other hand, Horace recalled the song of Raphael. He remembered how his presence, like that of some being of higher and purer nature, had checked the foul flood of vile conversation which had flowed amongst the banditti, and how in the dim twilight he on that morning had seen the young Italian kneeling in prayer. That last recollection raised in the bosom of Horace a feeling of self-reproach. Except a few instinctive ejaculations, which could hardly be called prayers, since his capture, he had neglected the duty of devotion. He had been so much taken up with his own hopes and fears, his difficulties and dangers. So great had been his eagerness to escape, and the excitement caused by the strange scenes passing around him, that Horace had not bent his knee in prayer, as he had been accustomed from childhood to do. And yet, never through the course of his life had Horace had greater need of divine protection. He had tried all earthly means for his deliverance, and all having failed, nothing remained for the prisoner but to turn unto him in whose hands are the issues of life and death. Under the spreading branches of the oak, in the stillness of that wild and desolate spot, the young captive knelt down and prayed. Horace prayed for his mother, for himself, more for rescue from earthly trials than for grace and strength to endure them, for the youth was yet ignorant of human weakness and of the objects for which affliction is sent to the sons of men. See the heretic at his beads, exclaimed the mocking voice of Beppo, who, with 2 or 3 of his companions, had sauntered lazily forth into the sunshine. Horace was on his feet in a moment, ashamed, strange cause for shame, at having been discovered by these men in the act of prayer. The scornful laugh of the robbers brought the blood to his cheek. The banditti had merely come out of the cave to sun themselves in the morning beams, and enjoy in the open air the dolce far niente of which the Italians are so fond. They stretched themselves on the ground in front of their den, and the better to beguile the time, amused themselves by asking the young stranger a number of questions regarding his country, its customs, its people, its ruler, making their comments upon his replies in a half-jocular, half-insulting manner, which sorely tried his patience. Common sense, however, showed Horace that there was little to be gained by quarreling with men who held his life in their hands, and that it was better to bear an insulting jest than to try whether the robbers' stilettos had keener edge than their wit. Partly to change the current of conversation, and partly to gain information on a subject that interested him, Horace suddenly asked Beppo where the rossignol had learned the song which he had sung on the preceding night. "Whoever asked where the nightingale learns its lay," answered the robber, whose face looked even more repulsive when seen by the clear light of day than it had done by torch gleam. "And yet notes of his sort suit our wild haunts so ill, that I trow that he learned it in his cage." "He has been in prison, then?" asked Horace. "Oh, he, like most of us, has known what it is to lodge free, gratis, and for nothing at the expense of our gracious King Francis," laughed Beppo, "and has found the bedchamber none of the airiest, and the royal fare none of the daintiest." "And for what offense?" began Horace. But Enrico, who had joined the party, fiercely cut his questioning short. "There be ways of shackling tongues as well as limbs," he exclaimed, resting his right hand on the butt of his pistol and glaring at young Cleveland as if he had touched a wound. Horace made no attempt to pursue the conversation so rudely interrupted. The banditti began to amuse themselves with dirty cards, gambling away their ill-earned spoils, and Horace, as he sat watching them in silent disgust from under his tree, saw many things that had belonged to himself and his mother staked and lost in play. Then came the noonday meal of macaroni and the peculiar fruit of the cactus, which was eaten in the open air and of which the prisoner, with a rude hospitality, was invited by the robbers to partake. The day had now become oppressively hot, and the banditti, after the fashion of their country, stretched themselves on the ground to enjoy their afternoon siesta. Horace did not sleep. Even had he been in the habit of conforming to this Italian custom, he would now have felt too restless and anxious to do so. In a half-recumbent position, he remained listening to the loud, monotonous noise of the cicala, a kind of beetle that all day long fills the air with its harsh grating sound, and watching the lizards as with quick motion, their lithe, slender forms glanced in and out of holes in the rock. Familiarity with the sight of the robbers had rather lessened his fears of danger from them, and though Horace had small hope of effecting his escape by any efforts of his own, he had strong expectations that the unwearied exertions of his mother would avail to procure his release. When the sun, sloping towards the west, was throwing the broad shadow of the mountain across the valley which stretched in front of the cave, the banditti prepared to start upon some lawless expedition. The day of listless indolence and reckless gambling was probably to be succeeded by an evening of crime. Horace was well pleased to find that Matteo had no intention of dragging his captive with him into the woods. The youth had exchanged no word with the chief on that day, but before the robber quitted his mountain haunt, he strode up to Horace and addressed him with an expression of savage determination upon his hard features that was calculated to inspire more fear than the tenor of his words. I need hardly command you, boy, not to stir beyond this platform of rock, as, even were you unfettered, it would be impossible for you to find your way through yon forest without a guide. It may be as well, however, to remind you that these woods are our familiar haunts, that watch is kept there by night and by day, and that a network surrounds you there which you would feel before you saw it. Were you detected in any insane attempt to break through the toils, short and sharp would be the means taken to curb your restless humor. You are not the first prisoner whom I have kept for ransom, and I have found a little iron in the foot a more effectual restraint than a great weight of iron around it. I joined in Beppo, who had overheard the threat. The procurator of Garda will go halting for the rest of his life, as a token that he passed one night in the den of the wolf, and tried to make his escape in the morning. Chapter 10. The Lone Sentinel. Horace had not been left many minutes to ruminate over the bandits' parting warning, when the sound of a melody, warbled in rich tones which, once heard, could ever afterwards be recognized, announced to his glad ear that the rossignol was coming through the forest. Little as the captive had seen of the improvisatore, he yet welcomed him as a friend. I have been impatient for your return, Horace exclaimed, as soon as Raphael emerged from the trees. Have you heard any tidings from Subtitle? Can you give me any news of my mother? Raphael made a sign in the negative as he advanced to the foot of the rocky ascent. Horace leaned over the rough parapet and said in English, "Could you not contrive to bear a note or a message from me to my mother?" "Matteo made me give my word of honor that I would not do so," replied Raphael. "Had he not bound me by that which he knows that I never break, he would have detained me in his fastness here, almost as close a prisoner as yourself." With the agility of a chamois, the young Italian now ascended the rocks to gain the platform in front of the cave, unimpeded by his instrument, which he carried slung behind him. His first glance, on reaching the spot where Horace awaited him, was directed towards the fettered ankles of the captive. "You have been attempting to escape," he said quickly. "Is it a crime in your eyes to make an effort for freedom?" asked the prisoner. "In your case it is useless. Utterly useless. Worse than useless," said Raphael with earnestness. "I know better than you can know in how close a clutch you are held. I see, as you cannot see, the pitfalls surrounding you here." "But what can I do?" exclaimed Horace impatiently, chafing under the sense of bondage like a caged lion. "Trust in God," was the reply, and these 3 words, uttered with the manly simplicity of one who in himself had proved their power, dispelled in the mind of Horace every lingering doubt and suspicion as regarded the character of Raphael. Wonderingly, he resolved the mystery of the connection of a man of no ordinary earnestness of devotion with the lowest and worst of his race. As little would Horace have expected to find the rich blossoms of the passion flower twining round a cluster of poisonous fungi, or a jewel glittering on some heap of corruption, as a firm, decided Christian man in a den of robbers and thieves. How could a raindrop retain its purity when mixed with the stagnant waters of a pool? How could the spark of faith still live with so fierce a storm of temptation around it? While Horace was reflecting on his strange companion, Raphael, laying aside his guitar, had entered the cave. He soon returned, bearing with him such liniment as he had used in the morning to relieve the pain caused to the captive by the chafing of his fetters. Raphael then knelt down upon the rock and applied the simple remedy. Horace, unaccustomed to suffering or restraint, could scarcely endure the pressure of the iron upon his galled and swollen ankles. He implored Raphael, as he had urged Enrico, to release him from the torturing bonds. Sadly but firmly his suit was refused, and when pressed, it only wrung forth the unanswerable question, "Would you have me sacrifice the life of my brother?" When all that was possible had been done for the prisoner's relief, Horace asked Raphael, with some curiosity, what was the favor which he had his intention of one day asking. "I ask it now," replied the Rossignol, and to the surprise and almost disappointment of young Cleveland, he drew forth from his bosom a small English Testament, which bore marks of having been much used. "I would have left this with you this morning," said Raphael, "but I feared lest my treasure should be discovered and taken from you by force. See, it is in English," he continued, "and the little which I know of that tongue has been chiefly learnt from its pages, but my knowledge is very imperfect. Oft in vain I struggle to make out the meaning of a passage, like one groping in the darkness of a cave. You, who can speak my language as well as your own, will make all clear and plain to my understanding." "How did you get this?" asked Horace with interest, turning over to the title page, on which the name of Pietro Marino was written. "Let us leave the tale to another day," replied Raphael. "Time is now precious. I expect that the band will this evening return more early than usual. Could you know how long and how anxiously I have waited for such an opportunity as this, you would not marvel at my reluctance to hazard its loss by delay." So saying, Raphael threw himself on the rock beside Horace, and eagerly turning over the pages of the Testament, showed place after place where he had found difficulties from his imperfect knowledge of English. Horace had often read the Bible with his mother, often listened to chapters in church, and had with tolerable regularity, though with slight attention, perused the scriptures by himself. But the cold, lifeless form which the performance of this duty had too often been to the youth was something different indeed from the intense earnestness which he now saw in his strange companion. It was evident that to Raphael, religion was a living reality, something that engaged all the powers of his mind as well as all the affections of his soul. The Bible was to him as the Father's letter, treasured in the bosom of the Son, as the charter by which he held all his dearest hopes, as the pardon signed and sealed, granted to the prisoner by the grace of his King. The Rossignol and Horace read together as long as the daylight lasted, and when that failed they returned to the cave, and pursued their occupation by the gleam of the tapers which were lighted in front of the Virgin's shrine. Horace was well versed in scripture history, but he had only a very superficial knowledge of the epistles of St. Paul. The glowing, fervent spirit of devotion breathing through them had found no response in his heart. He read now, almost as though they were new to him, the soul-stirring words of the apostle and martyr, proclaiming the blessed truths which he so joyfully sealed with his blood. Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong. Horace felt that the Italian at his side was not merely reading this as a chronicled address to suffering saints of old, but receiving it as a rousing call to himself, a watchword to be used on the field of battle, a command from a leader to a soldier of the cross. "Is it true?" asked Raphael, when at last he paused in his reading. "Is it true that in your blessed land these scriptures are open to all?" "The poorest can have a Bible," replied Horace. "What a power must be wielded there for the truth," said the Italian, laying his hand upon the open testament. "In this country there is but a man here and there, like a picket in a hostile land, a sentinel on a post of danger, to grasp with a feeble hand the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God, standing forth in a cause which, were it not the cause of the Almighty, he might well consider to be desperate, but with you, how strong, how united a phalanx must hold the ground against all opposers, and go forward conquering and triumphant in the great battle that is waged on earth." "Of what battle do you speak?" said Horace, rather to draw forth an answer from Raphael than from any difficulty as to his meaning. "The great battle between truth and error, light and darkness, God and Satan," replied Raphael. "That battle in which every individual must be enlisted on one or the other side. Not necessarily to take any very active part," observed Horace, who felt as regarded himself there had been little interest and certainly no great effort in the strife. Raphael fixed his large, earnest eyes upon the speaker with an expression of grave surprise. "In the world's warfare," said he, "what do we esteem a soldier who shrinks from taking his part in the struggle, who obeys not his leader, who deserts his banner at a period of danger?" "We esteem him a coward," replied Horace. "And if he takes part with the enemy?" "He has the name and deserves the fate of a traitor." "And what shall we call those who, enlisted from infancy to oppose sin and Satan, are content to remain mere spectators of the strife, or who actually join the ranks of the foe?" "9/10 of the Christian world do so," observed Horace, "and certainly look upon themselves neither as cowards nor traitors. Few consider that there is any battle to be fought at all. Men follow their own pleasure, do their own will, and doubt not but that all will be well in the end." "You do not think so?" said Raphael. Horace knew not what to reply. He was too conscious that he had been describing his own state of mind, and felt that if a brave, earnest, self-sacrificing spirit of devotion be necessary to the Christian soldier, he was unworthy of the name. Willing to change the conversation, he said abruptly, "You must be indeed as a sentinel in a hostile land. I wonder how you can keep your ground at all in this the very stronghold of the enemy." "I can but grasp my sword and look to my leader," said Raphael. "I am sometimes well nigh ready to give up all in despair, but he can keep me from falling. I marvel why you remain here, began Horace, when he was prevented from concluding his sentence by the sound of a shrill whistle from the wood, and Raphael, hastily rising, thrust his testament into his bosom. "I knew that they would return soon," he said. "See where yonder they come." The banditti returned in a very discontented mood. They had found no prey and brought back no booty. The only consolation which they found under their disappointment was that of exercising the power of tormenting, and their unfortunate prisoner had to run the gauntlet of every kind of annoyance. Horace, little accustomed to insult, chafed with impotent rage. He glanced at Raphael, as though to claim his protection, and the rossignol, without appearing to notice the appeal, came to his relief in the only effectual way. The liquid tones of his guitar were heard through the noisy uproar, and the tumult suddenly lulled. The notes exercised such a spell as fable ascribes to that of Orpheus, and almost as savage and auditory as that which listened to the ancient bard, gathered around the rossignol as he poured forth his thrilling lay. There is a sword of glittering sheen. All unite to defend the right. Its blade is bright, and its edge is keen, but the wound it gives is a wound unseen. And who would flinch in the glorious fight? There is a foe, a ruthless foe. Such unite to oppose the right. In secret ambush he croucheth low, and the blow he strikes is a deadly blow. But who would flinch in the glorious fight? There is a banner floating wide. All unite to defend the right. The blood of martyrs its folds has dyed, when the best and the bravest fought side by side. For who would flinch in the glorious fight? There is a leader exalted high. All unite to defend the right. Through him his followers hosts defy. Through him they learn to do and to die, and scorn to flinch in the glorious fight. There is a palm, a victor's palm. All unite to defend the right. 'Twill be given in realms of peace and calm, to the steadfast spirit, the stalwart arm, that never flinched in the glorious fight. Then shall lips touched with living flame in song unite, in the world of light, in our leader's strength, in our leader's name. We fought, we struggled, we overcame, and victors stood in the glorious fight. So spirited was the air, so flowing the measure, that Matteo himself beat time with his heavy hand on the table, and several of the banditti actually joined in the burden. Horace saw, however, by the glances directed towards the improvisatory, that the words were only tolerated on account of the music, and Enrico, as if the strain were hateful to him, quitted the table before the song was ended. On the mind of the young prisoner himself the effect of the lay was powerful. He felt his spirit roused by the music, which seemed to burst forth from the singer's soul rather than from his lips. Horace realized, as he had never done before, his own responsibilities as a sworn soldier of Christ. Had he not been enlisted to serve under the banner of the cross, to fight manfully against the world, the flesh, and the devil? And how had he kept his vow? How had he fought under that banner? What interest had he taken in the holy cause? What had he ever sacrificed in order to spread its conquests? It was not needful for Horace to compare himself with missionaries spending their strength and hazarding their lives to win heathen lands for their leader, nor with the devoted men and women who in densely crowded cities lead the assault against the enemy's mightiest strongholds. Such may be termed the forlorn hope of the Christian host, the Gideons or Davids of the army. But had he shown himself worthy to be counted even amongst the common rank and file? Had he ever struck one good blow for the sake of religion against a besetting sin? Had he cared even to keep his sword bright? Had he not felt ashamed on that morning at being discovered in the act of prayer? Could he regard himself as other than a coward, even if he deserved not the name of traitor? How the lay rang that night in the ears of Horace! The music haunted him when he retired with Raphael to the rocky recess, whither they had been preceded by Enrico. Horace there found a fresh bed of fragrant herbs, which had been gathered for him, over which was thrown a mantle which he had seen on the shoulders of Raphael. In silence the Rossignol knelt down to pray, and the young Englishman knelt beside him. Horace expected some taunt from Enrico, who lay stretched on his heap of leaves, but the bandit watched them in sullen silence, by the light of a torch which he had stuck on the wall. As Raphael was making his simple preparations for the night, in removing a portion of his dress, he bared his shoulder and accidentally displayed to the view of Horace a hurt which he had received on it, a purple contusion, as from some blunt but heavy instrument. The injury had evidently been both recent and severe. "No light hand left such a mark as that," exclaimed Horace. "It was Matteo's work. It is no prison scar upon me," replied Raphael, covering the evidence of the chief's brutality. "And do you know how he won that scar?" exclaimed Enrico with vehemence. "In coming between the wolf and his prey, in trying to save that poor wretch Carlo from destruction. His attempt was in vain. All that he does is in vain. The hand that left that mark will fall more heavily upon him one day." It was long ere Horace could sleep. The sight of that bruised, lacerated shoulder had brought more vividly before him the savage nature of the man in whose absolute power he lay than aught he had seen or heard. Raphael must indeed, thought the captive, be as a sentinel on a post of danger, as a soldier isolated from his comrades in an enemy's land. Horace looked at the young Italian, stretched in peaceful slumber on his rocky bed, and wondered how his repose could be so serene and untroubled. It was the consciousness of the presence of a watchful guardian that gave to the soldier of the cross calm sleep in the robber's den. His last waking thought had been, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life, of whom shall I be afraid?" Chapter 11. The Orphan's Tale. A strange Sabbath was that to Horace, which commenced with the dawning day. He closed his eyes on the rude and gloomy cave around him, and tried to make memory and fancy replace the hateful scene. He sought to shut his ears to the noise of oaths, profane talking, and wrangling. Sadly, he recalled privileges unprized and too often neglected when he had had the power to enjoy them. He had frequently been weary of the quiet monotony of the holy day, desiring more active amusements, more exciting pursuits, and now remembered the peaceful Sabbaths in his home almost as though they had been spent in paradise, and sighed when the doubt presented itself whether he would ever be permitted to know such Sundays again. It need scarcely be said that the Sabbath was no holy season to the robbers. It was passed with rather more of noisy riot than the preceding day had been. There was more of the wild mirth so forcibly described as the crackling of thorns under the pot, the laughter which makes the thoughtful listener more sad than sounds of woe. The robbers gambled, danced, reveled, swore. Raphael was the especial target for their coarse jests, which he bore as one who was accustomed to endurance, a veteran in suffering, though young in years. Horace marveled how long the improvisatore had been subjected to the daily martyrdom of such an existence, a constant chafing and fretting like that of the waves against some solitary headland. Raphael, during the first part of the day, appeared to avoid the society of the prisoner. He neither addressed nor even looked towards him. It seemed to Horace that the young Italian did not wish his comrades to see that there was any community of thought or sympathy between them, and Horace felt that to have been recognized as the friend of the Rossignol would have increased the difficulties of his own position. It would have been like leaning on a lightning conductor while thunder was growling above. When gambling had succeeded to more noisy revels, the improvisatore approached Enrico, who was seated amid a group of his rude companions outside the cave. Horace, from his favorite seat under the oak, where he enjoyed comparative seclusion, watched with interest the movements of the brothers, though he could not overhear their conversation. Raphael laid his hand on Enrico's shoulder, stooped down, and whispered something in his ear. Enrico, who had a dice box in his hand, frowned and shook his head with a gesture of impatience. Again there was a low whisper, and the robbers around burst into mocking laughter. Distress, indecision were stamped upon the face of Enrico, and as Horace viewed on the one side the anxious, pleading look of the brother, on the other the dark glances of his reckless companions, he seemed to behold, in human embodiment, spirits of good and of evil contending for the possession of a soul. This time the good appeared to gain the mastery, for Enrico, suddenly flinging dice and dice box on the ground, sprang to his feet and followed his brother down the rocks into the forest, in whose recesses they were soon lost to view. They were absent for more than an hour, and on their return Enrico looked sadder and more subdued. With folded arms and downcast eyes, he emerged from the shadow of the trees. Horace suspected that the interview had had some relation to himself, for Enrico, after mounting to the rocky platform, stood for some moments before his prisoner, surveying him with a fixed and inquiring gaze. Then, as if answering some question to himself, he shook his head and turned sadly away. When, in the hottest and most oppressive part of the day, the banditti retired for their accustomed siesta, the improvisatore joined Horace under the oak. Again was the testament produced, and again the prisoner and his companion drank deeply of its life-giving truths. He who has never known severer thirst than that which makes a draught of cold water refreshing on a summer's day can scarcely conceive the feverish eagerness of the traveler in the desert, when, exhausted and parched with thirst, he bends over the lonely well. Raphael was treading the wilderness of life, the scorching sun of temptation above him, the burning sands of tribulation beneath his feet, and the scriptures were to him as the cooling waters to the pilgrim ready to perish. "I wish," said Horace, when at length there was a pause in the reading, "that you would tell me how you ever came to lead this strange life amongst robbers, and what induces you, unfettered as you are, to remain in this horrible place. Enrico has told me that your father was an officer of gentle birth. How came the sons of such a man to dwell in the haunts of banditti?" Raphael sighed as he made answer. "My father was of an honorable family, but his own heroic virtues would have ennobled any descent. He was without fear and without reproach. His name had never been coupled with disgrace. I was but a child when I last saw my father, but well do I remember, never can I forget, how I used to clamber on his knee and play with his sword knot, and how he would lay his hand on my head and tell me that I should one day serve the king, and that the duty of a brave soldier is simply prompt, unswerving obedience, obedience even unto death. And the lesson which my father gave to his child, he sealed with his blood. He received orders to defend a mountain pass from the enemy with a small body of troops that were placed under his command. I know not, it was never clearly ascertained, whether in the confusion of a general retreat that small band was actually forgotten, or whether the commander had found it impossible to send reinforcements to its aid, but it was isolated, unsupported, and attacked by a greatly superior force. Some of those under my father's command urged the necessity of retreat. Resistance, they said, was hopeless. To attempt to defend the pass was but to throw away the lives of his men. I was placed here to hold this post, was the gallant reply. Until I receive orders from my leader to quit it, here I am bound to remain. It is his office to command, and mine to obey. The men, continued Raphael with emotion, were not inspired by their captain's heroism. False to their trust, one by one they deserted their banners. A single brave man remained firm as a rock at the post of duty. Where my father had planted his colors, there he fought, and there he fell. And did not your king reward such generous devotion by caring for the fatherless children of such a man? Exclaimed Horace, as Raphael, with a deep sigh, closed his brief account. Earthly princes do not resemble him who keeps a record of every act of obedience, replied Raphael. There were a few words of praise, a ribbon, and a cross, and then all appeared to be forgotten. My brother and I might have starved in the streets of Naples, but for the kindness of our mother's father, a physician, who supported and educated us for the sake of a daughter whose loss he yet mourned. Enrico became weary of the monotony and restraint of the life which he led in the good old man's home. He spent much of his time away from it, and became acquainted with some who made no good use of the influence which they acquired over his generous and confiding nature. When I had reached the age of 15, my grandfather died. I was with him at the last, received his parting blessing, and closed his eyes. All my earthly comfort was buried in his grave. I will not dwell on the events of the following year. Raphael chose not to unveil to the eye of a stranger scenes of riot and selfish profusion in the house which the memory of a venerable relative had to him rendered sacred. He would not relate how Enrico had recklessly squandered his young brother's inheritance as well as his own, exposing the orphan left to his guidance to the contamination of such society as might have ruined his soul as well as his fortunes. Raphael was tender of the reputation of a brother whom he yet loved with the strength of that affection which can bear all, hope all, endure all. But though the Rossignol purposely left out all the darker shades of the picture, Horace had already seen enough of Enrico to fill up the outlines for himself. After a brief pause, Raphael continued his narration. I was sleeping one night in my chamber when I was startled from slumber by the sudden entrance of my brother. It was the hour before dawn, when darkness is deepest. I could not see his face, but I was alarmed by the grasp of his icy hand and the strange, altered tone of his voice. Raphael, he exclaimed, we must fly. I am a ruined man. The bloodhounds are already on my track. I found afterwards that my unfortunate brother had been mixed up in a night brawl, in which a man of high rank had been killed, and that Enrico was suspected, falsely suspected. Raphael laid strong emphasis on the word, of having dealt the fatal blow. Enrico had no means of proving his innocence. He had little money left and no friends. He had been the victim of men more unscrupulous and reckless than himself, who were willing to screen their own guilt by sacrificing their dupe. Why should I dwell on a painful theme? Before morning we fled from Naples. Pursued by the ministers of the law, Enrico took refuge in these mountains of Calabria and, driven to desperation, in an evil hour joined himself to a band of outlaws. I accompanied his steps and shared his fortunes. Then it was through no error of your own that you became associated with these men of blood? I say not so, replied Raphael quickly, nor can attempt to justify my weak compliance. I was young and inexperienced, indeed, but not so young nor so ignorant as not to see the snares into which I was running. I was carried on by an impetus which I had not sufficient strength of principle to resist. My own views of religion and duty were dark. My conscience, indeed, was not dead, but while I could stifle its reproaches by supposed good deeds, while Latin prayers and long fastings could, as I thought, atone for sharing the booty of the robber in his worst crimes, thank God I never shared. I pursued my course with but little remorse. I will not weary you with accounts of pilgrimages to holy shrines made with bare and bleeding feet, nor tell you how many hours at night were often spent in reciting prayers that I understood not. Vain superstition. Miserable opiates to put to sleep the restless monitor within. I was a favorite with Matteo and his followers. My youth, and perhaps my love of music, and my slight knowledge of the healing art, won for me more kindness and indulgence than it might have been supposed that such men could have shown. I ministered to their pleasure and to their comfort. They loved my jests and my songs. I might say whatever I liked, almost do whatever I liked. I was as the spoiled child of the band. Horace felt no surprise that the gifted boy, attractive in person and winning in manner, should have exercised powers of fascination over the rough spirits around him. The prisoner had himself begun to feel in the society of Raphael a kind of magnetic influence, which made him watch every look and listen for each word, with a strange interest for which he could scarcely have accounted. Circumstances, however, had evidently altered as regarded the connection of Raphael with the banditti, and Horace remarked to the Rossignol that he seemed to be now rather tolerated than liked. "How is it," asked young Cleveland, "that the once spoiled child of the band is now treated with such harshness and even brutality that it seemed to me today as though your very life were scarcely worth a day's purchase? How is it also that you have learned to put away superstition, to see the folly of dead forms, and have become so earnest in the service of God that you are ready to hazard all for his sake?" "It is a long story," replied Raphael, "and I hear by the sound of voices in the cave that the bandits' siesta is over. We must not be seen together," he continued, rising hastily from his seat. "You have perils enough to encounter as an Englishman, a Protestant, and a prisoner, without its being added to your list of offenses that you can call Raphael a friend." Horace was disappointed at the interruption to the tale of the improvisatore, and awaited with curiosity and interest a fitting opportunity to hear its conclusion.